And now we'll be moving on to a panel discussion. Allow me to introduce the discussions proper. The first session that we have is on addressing the gaps, technology, R&D, and market-based measures. And during this session, we will discuss the concrete steps to address the technology, policy, or funding gaps for maritime decarbonization through options such as market-based measures, MBMs, and research and development R&D as well. And we'd also like to show the pigeonhole slide on screen. This session will be using an online interactive Q&A software. And to post your questions and comments, please go to pigeonhole.at, or you can scan the QR code as well. I'm sure many of us are familiar with QR codes. And please input the passcode SMW2022, and this will allow you to vote on questions and will allow you to input questions to ask the panel as well. Thank you very much. And right now, let us introduce our panelists. We have a mix of live and online panelists. The moderator of this session is Mr. Sturla Henriksen, Special Advisor, Ocean, UN Global Compact, who is joining us virtually today. And joining Sturla on the panel are the following distinguished speakers. May I invite them to join us on stage? Let's welcome them warmly as they join us on stage, all right, ladies and gentlemen? First and foremost, let us welcome Professor Lynn, Chief Executive Officer, Global Centre for Maritime Decarbonisation, GCMD. Welcome, Prof. Welcome, Prof. Lynn. Thank you for your applause. Next, let's invite Chai Kah Hin, Associate Professor, National University of Singapore, Centre of Maritime Studies. You may give a wave to the audience if you'd like to. And next we have Martin Humphreys, is the lead transport economist from World Bank. He has a pre-recorded video for the event that will be played later on. And following him, joining us live is Mr. Simon Bennett, Deputy Secretary, International Chamber of Shipping. Thank you for joining us. And last but not least, joining us online, we have Dominik Englert, Economist, Transport Global Practice, World Bank, who is joining us virtually and will represent Mr. Humphreys on the panel. Panelists, you may remove your mask if you'd like to, because we are socially distanced. And right now, I'd like to invite, we'll be having some presentations, I believe, at the start, and then we'll have a panel in a while. I would like to invite up on the podium for our first presenter, and she is our Professor Lynn, CEO, the Global Centre for Maritime Decarbonisation. Let's welcome Prof. Lynn, please. Welcome.
Can you hear me? Great. So for those of you who've been with us all day, I apologize. Please bear with me. I was asked to tell you about technology gaps, and I thought it was important to first tell you how we see the energy transition. Oh, I can't see my slides. Okay. Good. So, international shipping's emissions went up by 5% last year. To get to our 2050 goals, or to get to net zero, we need to move as quickly as possible. The zero carbon fuels that we've been talking about, they are long-term solutions. They're not available today. There's no supply chain, there's no infrastructure. So that sort of belongs in the far category. So in order for us to get to net zero, we believe we need to bend the curve now. We need to start bending the curve now. So what that means is we need to do what we can now with what we have. So we need to look at near-term solutions. We need to look at mid-term solutions. So that would include technologies that can improve energy efficiency, technologies that can reduce fuel consumptions. It would include low-carbon fuels that are available today. Now, granted, there are issues associated with them. We readily admit that. But we think we can solve those issues. There are issues associated with scale with biofuels. We think we can solve that. And we're not going to use biofuels in totality. There are challenges associated with natural gas. Slip, leakage, those need to be solved. But we believe natural gas is a pathway towards decarbonization as well, because as you move along, you can introduce biogas, you can introduce carbon capture, which is what we think could be a midterm solution. And that would provide the runway to developing the supply chain and the infrastructure for green fuels. So as we look across the ecosystem, this was one of the first things we did at GCMD to identify technology gaps. We mapped out the ecosystem, and the ecosystem is really, really complex. There are fuel producers, and then there are fuel users, et cetera, and just looking at the fuel supply chain, to support that fuel supply chain, you need the entire ecosystem to support it. And this is why we've been working hard also to engage with the ecosystem. In fact, since we've been in existence, we've talked to more than 150 stakeholders, really to understand where the pain points are and where the gaps are. So this is GCMD's 5-year project outlook to identify, with the gaps identified. We need to look at long-term solutions, and we've chosen to start with green ammonia. That's not to say that we believe green ammonia is the only solution. We've just chosen to start there. And in identifying gaps, we saw that safety associated with bunkering ammonia is a gap that we could address. And so we've embarked on a study to define the safety envelope, to define the operations envelope associated with bunkering ammonia. So with these safety guidelines identified, they will form the basis of a regulatory sandbox with which we can start a pilot. And so that's next. If the operational assets aren't ready, we're going to proceed with a proxy asset because there's no time to lose. We're looking at drop-in fuels framework. I think if you were here earlier on, you heard about the challenges associated with drop-in fuels. Green fuels command a premium, so how do we assure that that green premium is what we're buying for? So looking across the supply chain to provide transparency on quantity, on quality, and on abatement potential would be very, very important. We would start with biofuels because that's available, but the idea is when you generate such a framework, you can translate and extend that towards the next fuel, like bio-LNG into LNG, because biogas is not necessarily available at scale, and you would have to dose it into LNG, and then eventually green methanol into gray methanol, or green ammonia into blue ammonia into gray ammonia. So the idea of drop-in is to provide that robust framework around it. Other near-term solutions that we're looking at include wind-assisted propulsion, and then with respect to a midterm solution, we're super interested in shipboard carbon capture. There are challenges associated with that. When you burn 1 ton of fuel, you generate 3 tons of carbon dioxide, so the volume and where you store it becomes a problem. The debunkering process, if you will, to remove carbon dioxide from ships is something that we would have to look at as well. So these are some of the gaps that we've identified across the kinds of potential solutions out there. So looking forward to a fruitful conversation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Lynn. Thank you. Next up, I would like to please invite Professor Chai Kah-hin, Associate Professor at National University of Singapore, to share with us some of his thoughts on the idea of route-based action plans. Prof, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to share with you our ideas of a route-based action plan. Can I have a slide, please?
Yes, it's on.
Okay, yes. Yeah. Okay, good. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Professor Ng Soo Hui, Ernest Ng, and Professor Lin Lu, that we have brainstormed and worked very hard and make sure that this idea sounds reasonable. Okay, so we have a small paper on this, and I'm happy to share a copy of the paper with you after this. Okay, so around September last year, we had the opportunity to analyze the data collected as part of the NextGen project. So as you know, the NextGen project is a project that aims to collect all the information related to decarbonization projects, initiatives around the world. And I think as has been mentioned a few times, there you can see that across the world, there are many projects at different stages of technology readiness that aim to address this decarbonization problem. Okay? Now, we were able to analyze the data set from many different angles. We mapped the technology readiness level. We look at the organization behind these projects. And indeed, it was quite heartening to see the effort behind many of this. But there was a big problem. The problem is that we were not able, in some sense, to determine how all these projects will reduce, how much GHG reductions can be achieved collectively by this project, when and where. Okay? So it took us a long time to see that how can we address this? Why do we end up in a situation where we have a lot of initiative, but there's no way that we can tell that we are making the necessary progress between now and 2030 and now and 2050. So it struck me that, instead of moving from left to right, then maybe we should look at from the right to left, right? So the whole idea is that if we can take the big, difficult, daunting, complex, political, economical, technological problem, like a global GHG decarbonization, and reduce it to something more bite-sized on a route-based basis. Now, immediately, to me, we are making the problem a lot less complex. The context will be a lot more specific. The discussions about technology, infrastructure, fuel type, supply chain security will be a lot easier. Discussions will be a lot more convergent. And when we reach a certain satisfactory level, we move, we green the route. As a technology professor, I always believe technology is ready and technology is never ready. So there's never a time that we can wait until a technology is ready for implementation. And if we can adopt that perspective, we can then green the routes one at a time, or a few at a time. And this way, we can then collectively, perhaps at some point, reach a reasonable progress. Now, you might ask, what about interoperability problem? Now, indeed, this is a concern, right? I mean, as part of this process, we shared the paper with some colleagues, and they've given feedbacks about what about liner, tram, and sport. And I think I have an answer to that, or at least a preliminary answer. Now, the compatibility between the technology and the infrastructure indeed is a concern. But as we have seen today, right, that all of us are committed to discuss, knowledge shared, converge our standards to ensure that we have some sort of interoperability in the end. Okay? So to me, I would like to advocate that we need to start greening the sea by greening the routes. Okay? One way to do this is to adopt a route-based action plan concept. We focus on the outcome, the GHG amount to reduce, less on the infrastructure, less on the choice of the infrastructure or the technology and so on. Okay? And it is a lot easier to align the technology, the field, and the other necessary components involved. Okay? And I think the route-based action plan complements nicely the national action plans under MEPC 75. And if we are innovative enough, and if we can invite third party to assess the credibility of the project, the action plan, we might even attract funding from ESG. There are funds out there, they're looking for green projects to invest in. And if this is possible, we open up a whole new channel of investing in these directions. Okay? And of course, if we start doing things on a route basis, we will be able to aggregate the GHG reductions towards this goal. Okay? And I also like to highlight that it is important for us to know that there's always unknowns. Technology is good, but technology can be also risky. And by perhaps spreading over a wider range, wider routes, we can avoid the over-reliance on a single technology. Okay? Last but not least, and I think this is crucial. Okay? I would like to think that we should scale our implementations, scale our R&D. Okay? So whenever a route is ready in their plans to meet the 2030 or 2050 goal, they should start, they should go ahead. So, in conclusion, I like to say that we should find the routes, and that's the way to green the sea. And shipping is international, but decarbonization may need to start local. Hopefully, in a few years' time, we will have a slide, we have a website like this that can show not only where the projects are happening, but also where the decarbonization are taking place on the sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Chai. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, our third and final presenter for this session is Martin Humphries, Lead Transport Economist, the World Bank, who will be sharing a video presentation with us in view of the time difference. Let's watch Martin's presentation, please.
Let me start by wishing everyone a very good afternoon in Singapore. It's my pleasure to contribute, at least virtually, to this fascinating session today. Last Friday, the World Bank published a new report on market-based measures in international shipping. I would like to take this opportunity to share some of its key findings with a focus on the following. Firstly, why the use of carbon revenues from a market-based measure appears more favorable to address equity considerations than exemptions. What revenue use options appear most aligned with the IMO debate on midterm measures? And finally, whether revenues should be used within the shipping sector or also outside the sector. As part of its strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from ships, the IMO's policymaking process is currently focused on midterm measures, including market-based measures. These market-based measures would not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they could also generate significant carbon revenues. These include a carbon levy or a cap and trade scheme where emissions allowances are not distributed for free. Initial estimates by partners are that between 1 to 3.7 trillion US dollars could be raised from a market-based measure in the shipping sector by 2050. This approximates to around 40 to 60 billion US dollars annually. The use of these potential revenues is the focus of my presentation today. As a reminder, the IMO initial GHG strategy includes two key equity principles to guide the decarbonization of international shipping. Firstly, there's the need to be cognizant of the common responsibility of states to address climate change, as well as the need to account for differing circumstances under which they do so. Secondly, there's the need to address disproportionately negative impacts on states that may result from climate action in shipping. These equity principles are likely to require some differential treatment between more developed and less developed countries. In principle, two main solutions can be imagined to address the challenges resulting from the need for an equitable transition. Firstly, exemptions, and secondly, the strategic use of the revenues raised from a market-based measure. Exemptions, however, risk creating a perverse incentive to deploy more polluting, less energy efficient, and possibly less safe vessels on routes that serve developing countries. By contrast, the strategic use of carbon revenues avoids such a situation and therefore appears to have considerably more merit to address the equity consideration. In terms of the actual use of revenues, the report looks at seven major options. It compares those 7 options, against the guiding principles of the IMO discussions on midterm measures. In addition, the report assessed them against selected key desirable features, such as climate benefits or development benefits. This assessment revealed 3 interesting findings. Firstly, some carbon revenue uses appear more aligned with the guiding principles and the desirable key features than others. The detailed technical discussion and a comprehensive red, amber, green matrix can be found in the report. But in brief, the revenue uses which seem most aligned are supporting in-sector climate change mitigation, enhancing maritime transport infrastructure, and financing broader climate goals. Secondly, While some revenue use options appear more aligned than others, we feel that none should be dismissed prematurely. The reason is that each of them has a unique value proposition and seems worthy, therefore, of further consideration. Thirdly, there's certainly a strong case to use a meaningful share of carbon revenues in the sector. However, the case for using some revenues outside the sector in addition appears even stronger. On the one hand, the carbon revenues potentially raised are likely to exceed the need of the sector to meet the current minimum IMO climate targets, and possibly also the investments needed to fully decarbonise the sector. On the other hand, financing broader climate and development goals beyond the shipping sector alone would likely have the potential to yield significant climate and development benefits more cost effectively and more extensively than a narrow focus on using the revenue on shipping-related activities only would achieve. For instance, it's unlikely that all the least expensive mitigation, adaptation, or development opportunities available are exclusively related to international maritime transport. The report foresees win-win situations here. As one example, the carbon revenues could be used to finance the production of renewable electricity. This in turn could be used to help the decarbonisation of shipping by creating a larger supply of zero carbon bunker fuels. This is one example of many. So to conclude, I would say our report should be seen as an open invitation to policymakers to consider a revenue-raising market-based measure. Such a policy would not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions more cost-effectively, but also enable a new additional set of climate and development actions. A unique feature, I think, of this type of market-based measure that is not offered by any other midterm measure currently under consideration. Let me stop there and wish you a very nice day.
We thank Mr. Humphreys for his message. Thank you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to move on to the panel discussion, where we will hear our panelists' thoughts on the topic of technology, policy, or funding gaps for maritime decarbonisation. I will now hand the time over to Sturla, our moderator. Thank you very much, Sturla. Sturla, please.
Thank you very much, and a very good morning to you all from the small and remote coastal village of Svolvær in Lofoten, which is an archipelago north of the polar circle here in Norway. It's very cold weather here, but people here have very warm hearts. It's a bit weird to sit on the other side of the globe to moderate a panel discussion in Singapore. But I guess this is about to become the new normal, so we better all get used to this, I guess. Congrats to the organizer for this important conference, and thanks for the excellent introductions by our panelists. Thank you also for the opportunity to discuss the need to decarbonize shipping towards the backdrop of urgent and existential challenges facing humanity. 2 years of the pandemic has ruined lives, businesses, and public finances, which has disrupted ocean supply chains, brought immense challenges to crew change and seafarers serving on board, and which has dealt major blows to world trade and global economic growth. Geopolitical tensions are rising. The rules-based UN-led world order, the very basis of the entire regulatory framework of shipping, is increasingly challenged. And Russia's brutal and unprovoked attack on Ukraine is not only causing heartbreaking suffering for millions of innocent Ukrainians, its repercussions and consequences will be felt all over the world for decades to come. And meanwhile, global warming is continuing to accelerate at an unprecedented pace. And let us all be clear, the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement is not a political ambition. It is a non-negotiable planetary boundary beyond which we risk slipping past nature's own critical tipping points. Just to calibrate it, for the 1.5 degree goal, we have 400 gigaton of additional emissions left. We're currently emitting approximately 50 gigaton a year. and increasing. That's less than 8 years at current emission rates. So more than ever, these pressing and existential challenges underscore the need to work and cooperate across traditional industrial, national, administrative, and academic boundaries, and more than ever, they underscore the crucial importance of the ocean and the ocean industries as part of the solution. And I would like to start by asking you, Simon, from ICS. Given ICS leadership of ship owner representation at IMO, what are the things that you think need to happen to ensure the rapid decarbonization of shipping? Simon.
Oh, thank you very much, Sturla, and it's very nice to see you. Very nice to be in Singapore, and I must confess, though, I'd forgotten about the joys of jet lag, which you're missing. To answer your question, hopefully I will complement rather than duplicate what others have already said. But I think there's really three things that governments need to take on board. Firstly, I think we need to recall that shipping is a global industry and we require global regulation. Otherwise, we have chaos. We also have to remember that I think it's about 60% of maritime trade now serves the economies of developing nations. So I think what governments really need to understand, first of all, is the enormous, absolutely enormous scale of the challenge that's been set for us. Within ICS, at the UN Global Climate Change Conference last year, we announced our support for a net zero target for 2050. But we should have no illusions about the really incredible scale of that ambition. If we're going to achieve that, if we're going to achieve zero carbon, we have to have zero carbon fuels. Of course, LNG, biofuels, even methanol, they're all very important, but ultimately these are transitional solutions. If we don't move really rapidly towards zero carbon fuels, as I think we heard from the Deputy Prime Minister earlier this week, we're about to build the next generation of ships. They've only got a 25-year life. So if we don't identify the pathway now, we're going to be left with billions, trillions of dollars of stranded assets, and the only way we're going to achieve the targets is actually through rationing of maritime transport, which will be disastrous for development. Secondly, what's really urgently important now is that IMO gets on and approves the establishment of the $5 billion IMO Maritime Research Fund, which we're very pleased that the government of Singapore is supporting. And we need this fund because despite all the initiatives that have been announced, there's still a massive shortage of funding available for research and development. If we can establish this fund, we can kickstart the rapid acceleration of the technologies that we need so that we can rapidly increase technology readiness levels because they're simply not quite there yet. I must say that we were disappointed by the outcome of the discussions at IMO at the Marine Environment Protection Committee meeting last November, where governments were frankly reluctant to take firm decisions. So it's absolutely vital that they take a decision at the MEPC meeting next June, because if the IMO Maritime Research Fund isn't taken forward, and it's being funded by industry at no cost to governments, I think ship owners around the world will find this incomprehensible, and people will start asking serious questions about whether IMO can continue to provide us with the leadership we need. And then finally, Sturla, just quickly, most importantly, I think what we need, it's really urgent now for IMO to establish a system of carbon pricing for international shipping. We need to close the price gap between conventional and the alternative fuels, and as we heard from the World Bank, provide potentially billions of dollars of funding to expedite the transition and to ensure that the developing countries aren't left behind. So I've taken up too much time, so thank you very much, Sturla, for the question.
So thank you very much, Simon. We shall revert to the role of the IMO and, of course, the need for global regulations for a global industry. But I'd like to turn to you, Dominik, about what we heard now in the presentation from the World Bank, your colleague at the World Bank, about the carbon levy. It has sort of, if I understand it, it has sort of two elements in it. One is a levy that will amend relative fuel prices and close the price gap, and the other is the revenues generated. How are they to be managed, by whom? And going to the first, in this situation of high and very volatile prices on bunker and oil and gas, doesn't that in itself serve as the first element of your proposal as a tax on carbon?
Thank you so much, Sturla, and thanks a lot to Singapore, to the MPA for inviting me to speak here. I would also like to share best greetings from my colleague Martin Humphreys, for whom it would just be kind of impossible time-wise to participate at the moment. Addressing your question, Sturla, you're right, but you're partially right, you're partially wrong, I would say. Partially right because, yes, the current higher prices definitely provide a price incentive to think about alternative options, to think about additional alternative fuels that can replace the current fossil fuels that dominate the sector to almost 100%. However, you've also mentioned something that is very important, and it is the volatility. What we currently have in terms of fuel prices is volatility. We don't have any long-term certainty where fuel prices are going to be, not even in a month's time, but definitely not in a year's time and definitely not in 10 years' time. In order to really trigger the energy transition that is needed in the sector, what we need there is kind of long-term regulatory certainty, also in terms of the fuel prices that we're going to see. And this can only be achieved through a market-based measure where the volatility in terms of bunker fuel prices is going to remain the same. But what all market participants are going to know is there is going to be a carbon price applied to these bunker fuels. That carbon price needs to be paid on fossil fuels. That carbon price doesn't need to be paid on zero carbon bunker fuels, or to a lower extent only on low carbon bunker fuels. And that provides a completely different, also psychological signal to the market to think about alternative options. And what we really think, you've mentioned this, let me just finish this very quickly. You've mentioned this, that market-based measure really serves two purposes. The main purpose is really close the competitiveness gap that we are currently seeing between the new generation of fuels that will be needed and the fossil fuels that are currently being needed, that are currently being used in the sector. However, this is the effective transition, as we call it. However, we also need to tackle the equitable transition in the sector. And therefore, this is the reason why we make the case for a revenue raising market-based measure that really provides the amounts of funding that are going to be needed to support those countries with greater difficulties managing this affecting transition.
Thank you, Dominik. Very interesting. And just to sort of calibrate what we're talking about here, what is sort of the range of the carbon tax that we are talking about? We hear different figures floating around. Are we in sort of the range of 50, 100, 250, 300, $500? What is the range? Could you indicate something?
Yeah, of course. the World Bank hasn't done any specific research on this yet, but what the numbers the estimates that we use in our reports, are estimates from the Getting to Zero Coalition and from the Maersk-McKinney-Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. And when you look at those numbers, then we talk about ranges something from $100 to $250 that will be needed to fully decarbonize the sector and close the competitiveness gap in terms of the price difference to the future alternative fuels.
Okay, thank you, Dominik. Professor Liu. Yes?
Sorry, let me qualify this, please. Per ton of CO2. So per ton of bunker fuels, it would be higher.
Yeah. I'd like to ask Professor Liu and Professor Chai about sort of the entire ecosystem surrounding the industry and the access and availability of zero-emission fuels. What will it take? What is sort of the main challenge facing the availability and of zero carbon fuels, whether ammonia and hydrogen? Because what we see now is, of course, in order to produce these fuels, you need electricity, and this industry will compete both for electricity capacity and also for ammonia and hydrogen used for other purposes. How do you see what will be sort of the main critical actions to be taken in order to make this ecosystem work? Maybe I could start with you, Professor Liu.
Thanks, Sturla, for the question. But before I answer your question, actually, looking at the World Bank's presentation prompted me to think about the definition on the word sector. How do you think about sector? In that specific example that you provided, in that presentation, sorry, it's not fair, Dominik, since you didn't make the presentation and Martin did, but maybe you know the answer too. The out-of-sector example was a renewable electricity project. But one can argue that that's, depending on how you define sector, that's within sector because you need the renewable project to generate the green hydrogen so that you can generate the green ammonia and green methanol that then feeds the shipping sector. So if that's out of sector, how does one think about that whole supply chain and that whole ecosystem? And I think this comes back to the question, Sturla, that you were asking me, right? I mean, I think the energy transition is very complicated. It's so intertwined that it's very hard to define where the boundaries are. And we've put in all these boundaries. These are all man-made, just simply because we think the accounting is easier. But inadvertently, I think we've sort of, we sort of bound ourselves to something that's sort of human constructs, right? So I mean, I'll just leave that as food for thought. And then coming back to sort of what you said, so from a technology and an operational feasibility perspective, I think we think a lot about standards, about regulations. And so I think, you know, in the case of new bunker fuels, safety standards is really important. So getting that done even before the green fuels are available, getting that done even before the engine and the ships are built, to us is a no-brainer, and we should get that done. And we can't get that done alone. The governments need to be involved. The regulatory authority needs to be involved. And early conversations with the regulatory authority is so critical because that speeds up the process before the standards are available. And so in that sense, with respect to GCMD, we're very, very fortunate to have MPA as a partner because they have opened doors for us to be able to talk to the relevant regulatory authority on several of these projects. And that provides relevance to what we do. It provides a robust framework with which we are thinking about addressing these gaps. That's true in the drop-in fuels project that we're scoping as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'd like to ask the same question to you, Professor Chai, and maybe also more specifically, how do you see the role of so-called green corridors. How can they play a role in this? Are they sort of a precondition for being able to develop the entire ecosystem of these zero-emission fuels?
Okay, thank you for the questions. I think the way that I like to see the concept of a route-based action plan, perhaps similar or different to the green corridor. I'd like to see first and foremost, the route-based action plan is a methodology that allows the stakeholders on a selected routes to converge to address their local problems. I often find it is very difficult to have a meaningful discussions when we set the context at a global setting. We are looking at a whole range, different business model, different time, different cargo, different regulations, different models. So to me, if we can get down to the specifics, there will be less ambiguity. The choice of the technology, the alignment of the supply chain, it will be a lot easier. So another way to think about the difference between route-based action plan and a green corridor concept is that, to me, route-based action plan can be seen as something equal to the business plan in the startup world. In the startup world, we often have entrepreneurs that work with technologies, suppliers, business people to get together a plan and saying that we're going to have this idea, it's going to solve certain pain points, and it's going to make some money. Right? And to me, if we can see the route-based action plan in that way, so essentially what we are facilitating is to allow the stakeholders on a particular route to come together and then pitch their ideas to maybe the World Bank, maybe IMO, or maybe some ESG fundings. Who knows? Right? So this way, we will build and move some routes before the rest. I think there's benefits in we seeing some success stories, we learning from the others, right? So it will build momentums, right? And that's my view about this route-based action plan and maybe the green corridor idea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chai. I'd like to turn now to the finance sector, because the finance sector is, of course, vital in order to fund the entire ecosystem for the green transition. I'd like to ask, maybe start with Simon and also Dominik. How you see the financial markets, how they are now acting in this situation, because already the green transition in itself entails both technological and commercial risks, but now we have the entire geopolitical environment, the entire environment of uncertain and maybe slowing global economic growth. How does this impact the funding and the financial markets as you see it from your vantage point, Simon?
I think there's actually huge interest in the investment sector in supporting the shipping industry. The problem again, though, is that until we know a bit more about what the pathway is, it's very difficult for anyone to make serious investment decisions, which again brings me back to why we need to increase funding for research and development now, so that by the end of the decade we're a bit clearer about where we're going. The only other thing I would add, because it's very important to remember the developing countries, and potentially I think there is a role for the UNFCCC Green Climate Fund. They have huge resources at their disposal which that they can apply to instruments, for example, such as an IMO market-based measure, in order to duplicate, multiply the impact of that funding in support of their agenda for developing countries.
Thank you. I'll pass on the same question to you, Dominik, and adding, because in one of your recent reports, you have stipulated that 90% of the investments needed for the green transition in shipping needs to be on land, onshore infrastructure investments. How do you see the finance sector acting in this situation of increased uncertainties? And what do you see as a role for public-private or blended finance to make this happen?
Thanks a lot, Sturla. Yes, actually that number also doesn't come from the World Bank. It's analysis by the University Maritime Advisory Services, but you're right. 83% of the investments are expected to go into land-based infrastructure, and exactly into those sectors that Lynn has pertinently called out, which will be renewable, which will be hydrogen production, which will be ammonia synthesis, and so on and so on. And I'm actually very happy to hear from Lynn already that those sectors or these parts of the industry are already considered in terms of shipping's decarbonization as part of the maritime sector, because this would have been something that would not have been the case maybe 5 or 10 years ago. What is going to be needed in terms of financing? Nowadays, we see already more and more that renewable energy production, renewable electricity production in terms of solar, wind, and so on gets cheaper than anything what you can achieve with fossil fuels. That's a fantastic development. On top of this, energy independence around the world becomes more and more important in light of the current geopolitical events. What I would like to emphasize here is really what Simon has just already. In order to support this and nurture this and really kind of accelerate this transition, we need regulatory certainty so that investors really know what the regulatory environment is that they are investing in, how it's going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years, and then they can basically make their business plans and base it on that. And what we are currently seeing is that even the first movers who are willing, who are progressive, who are willing to put kind of venture capital into the pilot and demonstrator projects, they are telling us, we can do this in the beginning, but in order to sustain it in the long term, we really need, for instance, a market-based measure or any other kind of regulation that creates a level playing field between our zero carbon bunker fuels and the fossil fuels used in the sector. And as you've just mentioned, blended finance, that is something that is going to be extremely important, and that's something that we think the revenues from the market-based measures could be used for, really supporting those countries with some difficulties in the energy transition through concessional finance, blended finance, for instance, and those countries with really major difficulties in the energy transition, even with grants, in order to make sure that we don't create a tiered market where half of the world ends up with the green vessels and half of the world ends up with the black vessels. But everybody gets the chance to achieve shipping's energy transition at a somehow equal pace.
Thank you so much, Dominik. Time is running fast. These are sort of really vast questions and challenges, but I would like to end giving each of you half a minute to answer a question which has gained the most votes on the pigeonhole here, which reads as follows: the IMO has GHG emission targets for 2030 and 2050, but climate change is an immediate challenge. What can be done in the immediate future, in the next 6, 12 months and 3 years time, to deal with this? And I'll ask you, Professor Liu, to kick off this final round. Half a minute, please.
Were you asking me?
Yeah.
Was that? Sure. Okay. I'll take that. So, I mean, aside from needing to move as quickly as possible on the technology gaps, I'll put out a call for action. So at GCMD, we're thinking about doing a trial that's living true to who we are on trialing this idea of collecting and dispersing funds, right? We don't have to collect a whole lot, but let's try this. I've talked to Bo Simonson of the Maersk McKinney Moeller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. he said that their center would be receptive to studying which market-based mechanisms, how it impacts technology adoption, what price points, et cetera, et cetera. We can take guides from there. We can take guides from ICS. We can take guides from World Bank. We can talk to the trade associations. We can talk to you. Let's try this, right? Let's do a collection mechanism. And then let's try to do a disbursement. Let's iron out where the kinks are in the mechanism and see whether we can do this. I'll put that out as a call.
Thank you so much. Simon, 10 seconds.
We mustn't forget the political dimension to all this, and keep talking about the developing countries, but if we want to move forward, we have to have their agreements and bring them along, and I just want to emphasize that point.
Thank you, Simon. Professor Kai?
Well, it's a long-term problem, so I don't think we can do much in the next 6 months, the truth is. But perhaps I also... GCMD you can. Okay, at GCMD you can. Okay, that is typically Lynn Lu. But I would like to say that perhaps we need some new thinking, right? That perhaps we need to move away by assuming that everyone has to move at the same pace, adopt the same technology, and even have the idea that the life cycle of an asset is 20 years. We are on the cusp of a big disruptions. Who knows, maybe the business model requires us to change, to think differently, right? What we, and predominantly I think that our mindset is that we have this model that has worked well for the last 50, 100 years. The payback period, the technology, the ports that we can call, the regulatory framework. What if decarbonization and other factors require us to have a different set of technology that as a result require us to have a different business model, right? Then our idea, our fixation that everything has to be as in the past, Simon, sorry. There has to be 20 years and in this model, will be up for challenge, right? I think if we can open up our mind a little bit, perhaps some radical, some novelties will come in, and then maybe we can move a bit faster than the speed that we're moving now. Yeah, that is my view, by and large, from as a non-shipping person. Thank you.
Thank you. We are on overtime, but I'll give you 10 seconds, Dominik.
Thank you. I think in the short term, in the instantly energy efficiency, and energy efficiency. The IMO has made a first step with the short-term measures, with the EEXI, with the TII. I think, or we think at the World Bank there is much more potential that could be exploited with more stringent energy efficiency regulation. We have started some research on speed optimization and on just-in-time arrival, and we think that we can bring fuel consumption down to the benefit of current greenhouse gas emissions, but also to the benefit of future fuels, green fuels needed in the sector if we exploit the energy efficiency potential in the sector to the maximum.
Thank you so much, Dominik. And that was a very pertinent ending of our excellent discussion. Very concrete, tangible, actionable advices. So thank you so much to our excellent panelists, to the presenters, and thank you also to the organizer for hosting this very important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sturla, and thank you to our distinguished panelists. Thank you. Thank you so much for the very timely and insightful discussion. We'd like you to put on your mask and head down to your seats. Thank you very much.